Today, life in another time will live one day in the skin of a real Viking. You're about to find out who they truly were. Were they filthy, brutal barbarians, as Western culture often portrays them? Or were they explorers, traders, and warriors with complex traditions, advanced technology, and a code of honor? We'll break a few myths, we'll destroy a few legends, and we'll reveal facts so shocking, they might change everything you think you know. Did you know the Vikings reached America nearly 500 years before Columbus? In the next few minutes, things are about to get even more interesting. Stay with us. Meet our guest, Bjorn Eriksen. It is the year 844, and Bjorn is standing on a small hill overlooking a Scandinavian settlement near the great trading city of Hedeby. Today, this place lies in northern Germany, close to the Danish border. Yes, you heard that right. When people hear the word Viking, they immediately think of Norway, or maybe Sweden. But Denmark has just as much claim to that legacy. And Hedeby was one of the 3 great Viking cities mentioned in the sagas. The other 2 were in Norway and Sweden. Finland, however, was not a Viking homeland. Vikings raided there, sometimes settled there, but Finland remained culturally distinct. Now, before we continue, let's define who the Vikings actually were. In the narrow sense, a Viking was a sea raider, active between the 8th and 11th centuries. Men who sailed across Europe, raiding monasteries, towns, and kingdoms. But that is only part of the story. In the broader sense, Vikings were the people who lived in Scandinavia and had their own kingdoms and complex social structures. But they were not a single unified empire like Rome. The term Viking also includes Baltic Slavic tribes who carried out sea raids. So, in a way, it became a collective word for people who lived a complex and often dangerous way of life. The word Viking itself comes from Old Norse, and scholars still debate its true meaning, proposing various theories. In Rus, they were called Varangians. In Latin sources, they were called Normans. And in England, people didn't overthink it. They simply called them Danes. Ironically, modern DNA studies suggest that ancient Vikings were genetically closer to people of Central Europe and northern Russia than many assume, though these studies may still be revised in the future. So let's talk about what we do know for certain. The fantasy of illiterate Vikings, a myth that still appears even in serious research, is simply incorrect. Scandinavian runes formed a complete alphabet that was used for over 1,500 years. And in some villages of Sweden, runes were still being used as recently as 100 years ago. Vikings were known to be deeply religious people, even if their religion was rather unique. We'll talk about Odin and Thor later. But first, let's talk about names. Just like everywhere else in the world, children were often named after gods. It wasn't unusual to meet a girl named Tora, a boy named Ragnar, or even someone called Thorbrand. One name deserves special mention: Inga. Its roots go back to the Viking Age, and it remains widely used even today. Our Bjorn is named after the bear, a symbol of strength and physical endurance. In the future, even a legendary Viking king said to have met Odin himself would carry that name. The surname Eriksen is far less dramatic. It simply means that Bjorn's father was named Erik. Have you watched Marvel movies? Thor's surname there is Odinson. Scandinavians didn't overcomplicate things, they simply added son to the father's name to create a surname. Interestingly, in modern Iceland, this tradition still exists, and their national football team list often makes people smile. Daughters, in turn, added the suffix daughter. The entire system was designed to make it easier to identify family lineage, because for Vikings, family and kinship meant everything. Our Bjorn would be hard to distinguish from an ordinary medieval farmer. The only difference is that the land he works belongs to him. This was legally protected. Even in bankruptcy, selling land to outsiders was nearly impossible. If Bjorn's family were to fall into ruin, they were obligated to first offer the land to relatives. This is one of the reasons Vikings avoided falling into the feudal structure common in Europe. Most Viking settlements were family-based. Several generations often lived together. They built long wooden houses divided into sections. And at the center was the hearth, where families cooked, talked, and lived together. Sheep, barley, oats, farming, and livestock care were shared responsibilities, rotated among family members just to survive. We are talking about northern territories. Growing wheat there was nearly impossible. Even today, only about 3% of Norway's land is suitable for agriculture. In Sweden, around 9%. In Iceland, barely 1%. Those numbers alone are enough to understand why Vikings were so driven to raid whatever they could. The answer to why they did it by sea also lies in geography. Scandinavia is not a friendly place. Mountains, fjords, and poor soil created a unique historical phenomenon. For our Bjorn, it was often easier to board a ship and sail to Uncle Ragnar in the neighboring village than to travel the same distance on foot. If the word ship gives you flashbacks of pirates and fear of drowning, Vikings felt the opposite. Climbing cliffs and crossing mountains was far more exhausting than calm sailing along the coast. Almost every respectable family owned a small boat, or at least had connections to someone who did. Otherwise, survival in Scandinavia would have been nearly impossible. And here we approach the first myth, one born from television series and religious propaganda. In shows like Vikings, Scandinavians are often portrayed constantly fighting and killing each other. That is simply not true. Yes, Viking communities did not always have centralized authority, but across most territories, unjustified killing could result in exile at best, and at worst, you might follow your victim to Odin yourself. Another detail that the TV series portrayed quite well, though many historians debate it, is the role of women. Here, the Vikings deserve credit. Scandinavian society was among the first in history to establish a form of real equality and formal marriage agreements. Our Bjorn Eriksen has a fiancée, Kraka. She lives in a neighboring village. The two love each other. But unlike much of Europe at the time, it was not so much the man who chose his bride. It was often she who chose him. No matter how wealthy a young man was, or how powerful his family might be, if he lacked a strong reputation for courage and successful raids, there would be no wedding. On paper, Viking society was patriarchal, and the final decision formally belonged to the head of the family. But in practice, no father or older brother would give a daughter away without her consent. The reason was simple. A Viking wife was not a decorative object. She was the one who managed the family estate, while her husband could spend months, even years, away on expeditions. At the same time, she raised children to become warriors. The famous king Ragnar Lothbrok once said, "I chose for my sons a mother who would pass on her fearlessness." And this was not merely poetic language. Women were full members of society. A fragment of an ancient law had survived, stating that even touching the hand of a Scandinavian woman without permission was punishable by a fine of 5 marks. At marriage, a form of contract was concluded. The groom granted his bride a share of his property, known as the mourning gift. There was also a bride payment given by the future husband to the bride's father. In return, the father sent his daughter with a dowry. Negotiations around marriage resembled a serious commercial agreement. In short, Marriage was no simple matter for Bjorn. The situation was further complicated by the fact that youth was not considered an advantage. While in parts of Europe, marriages could occur as early as age 10, Vikings preferred to marry closer to 30. The reason was practical. A man who survived to that age had a far greater chance of surviving a campaign than an 18-year-old youth. Delayed marriages were common. Couples might be formally betrothed, but the actual wedding could take place years later. It is worth noting that the TV series Vikings also accurately depicted another important detail. In the absence of their husbands, women could lead expeditions themselves, sword in hand. Viking society was in many respects genuinely egalitarian. In the year 844, Denmark was ruled by the very Ragnar Lothbrok, the main character of the television series. The show greatly exaggerated Ragnar's story because in reality, he was not an ordinary Viking. He was the son of Sigurd Ring, the previous ruler of Denmark. His official title was Konung, which in European terms translates as king. It should be noted that there is no definitive historical proof of Ragnar's existence. However, other historical facts are undeniable. For example, the Viking conquest of Paris. If we summarize, the mechanism of any Viking expedition was roughly the same. Our Bjorn raises sheep and then meets a konung from another settlement who calls men to join a campaign. Bjorn, along with the other able-bodied men of the village, gathers supplies, boards a ship, and follows the ruler. Sometimes the leader could be a local chieftain if the expedition was small. But in our case, we are speaking of a large-scale Viking invasion of France. At the time, this was not unusual. As early as 789, Vikings attacked the town of Dorchester in England and successfully looted it. In 800, Vikings established themselves on the Scottish Islands, and in 844, they sacked Lisbon, the capital of what is now Portugal. By then, Europe had grown accustomed to such raids, and unfortunately, this part is true. Medieval chroniclers did not exaggerate when describing the Vikings. They did indeed burn entire villages, stripping them of everything, down to the last grain. In Latin, there was even a common prayer that began, "Deliver us, O Lord, from the fury of the wild Northmen." It was spoken when Viking ships were seen on the horizon, as people prepared for battle. There is even a theory that we owe the formation of modern European states, in part, to the Vikings. After the fall of Rome, Europe was fragmented and unstable. But facing the Scandinavian threat, rulers were forced to organize life, logistics, and village defenses more effectively, precisely in order to resist them. But let's return to the year 845. Our Bjorn, together with a few dozen warriors under the leadership of Ragnar Lothbrok, sets out toward Paris. And before we begin, let's break down a few stereotypes. The main stereotype portrays Vikings as uneducated barbarians who behaved like simple bandits. In roughly 50% of cases, that was indeed true, but only in 50%. Vikings were not poor tacticians. It was no coincidence that they repeatedly managed to defeat British, French, and other regular armies. Konung Ragnar even maintained an intelligence network for reconnaissance. He also introduced among the Vikings a rule: do not burn villages, demand ransom instead. The logic was simple. If you spare the settlement, you can return in a few years and earn again. They approached Paris in much the same way. We deliberately referenced the event shown in the television series because the series portrayed it incorrectly. In the show, the Vikings staged Ragnar's fake death and infiltrated Paris disguised as a funeral procession. A similar event did occur in history, but it was not Paris, it was Rome. And even then, the story sounds more like a legend. It happened after Ragnar's death, when his son Bjorn Ironside ruled the Vikings. Wanting to surpass his father's capture of Paris, the son decided to conquer the richest city of the time, Rome. Bjorn assembled 62 ships, landed in Italy, and pretended to be dead. His companions spread a story that before dying, the Viking leader had decided to convert to Christianity. The funeral procession was allowed into the city. Bjorn then jumped out of the coffin, opened the gates from inside, and the city was taken. So what's the joke? The Vikings had mistaken the city. They didn't capture Rome. They captured the Italian city of Luna. As for Paris, it was taken in a more traditional way. Ragnar was an excellent strategist, and his spies brought him important news. France was in turmoil. Two factions were fighting for power. As a result, when the Viking army approached, it faced divided French forces. Through a refined tactical maneuver, Ragnar's forces defeated them. The Vikings did not even enter the city. Instead, King Charles the Bald, terrified, chose to pay Ragnar an enormous ransom. In the end, our Bjorn sailed home on a ship filled with gold. On the way home, Ragnar's army burned French towns that did not pay ransom. There was no mercy for those who refused. Sometimes the Vikings laid full sieges, waiting patiently until cities ran out of supplies and starving defenders could no longer resist. The Scandinavians also preferred attacking peasants during religious holidays, when people were resting or attending church services. That is how they captured Luna, the same city we mentioned earlier. So, as you can see, the myth of Vikings being nothing but reckless bandits is just that, a myth. Otherwise, they would never have conquered half of Europe. Another common myth claims Vikings were filthy and unhygienic. Christian propaganda portrayed them as dirty and foul-smelling savages. Because of this, some critics argue that modern TV series make Vikings look like fashion models. Of course, they were not runway models, but they were surprisingly clean by medieval standards. Our Bjorn even owns a special beard comb. Archaeologists find them in large numbers at Viking excavation sites. An English chronicler from the 13th century named John even expressed jealousy in his writings. According to him, Vikings easily seduced English women because they were well-groomed, neatly dressed, and bathed every Saturday. For medieval Europe, this was shocking, because hygiene on the continent was often neglected and poorly understood. There is, however, one small inaccuracy in the series. Ragnar Lothbrok is shown clean-shaven. Real Vikings did not shave their heads bald. Hair was shaved only in certain ritual or punitive situations. What lies ahead for our Bjorn? Another campaign in France, less successful than the first. Half of his army died from dysentery, and Paris could not be taken again. However, colonizing Iceland and Greenland was far more successful. There is documentary evidence of Viking settlements in those lands. And later, around the year 1000, Leif Eriksen landed in Newfoundland, in what is now modern-day Canada. Sailing past Greenland, Vikings reached North America long before Columbus, a fact supported by the saga of Eric the Red. There is still much more to say about Bjorn's life. For example, Vikings loved cats, while much of Europe despised them. In medieval times, inquisitors even burned cats alive, while Scandinavians protected and fed them. Common people often worshipped Thor more than Odin. And no, they did not wear horned helmets. Horned helmets were invented in 1876 for a theatrical costume design. Vikings also did not favor leather clothing. They preferred wool and linen garments. Many stereotypes have been forced upon Scandinavians. In reality, they developed advanced crafts, aesthetics, and blacksmithing skills. And we could talk about that for hours. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to us. Thank you for being part of this story.